Is the Book of Acts reliable?
Will you listen to yourself? That's absurd. Absurd? Yeah.
And you know, sometimes you make a copy of a copy, it's not quite as sharp as, well, the original. Well, that's kind of what happened.
19-2.
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. With my external writing projects and content here on YouTube, I've been looking at the Book of Acts a lot of late, and I keep coming back to a series of posts from March on the Bart Ehrman blog, where Bart debated the most formidable opponent he could find, himself. Now, most people don't read his daily blog entries, because it's a membership site. I know we often promote paid courses on this channel, but long before the recent paid course phenomenon, Bart was living out his non-faith by publishing daily purely to take care of his neighbors. 100% of the membership fees go directly to charity. Since 2012, the blog has raised over $2 million for organizations fighting poverty, hunger, and homelessness. Your subscription helps provide food, shelter, medical care, and other essentials to those in need. But beyond the charitable aspect, the blog itself is a treasure trove of fascinating content. Daily posts from Dr. Bart Ehrman, one of the world's leading scholars on the New Testament and early Christianity, in-depth accessible discussions on topics like the historical Jesus, the Gnostic Gospels, and the development of Christian theology, a welcoming community where you can engage directly with Dr. Ehrman and other members through comments and Q&As, access to an extensive archive of past posts, over a decade's worth of content to explore. So if you want to expand your knowledge of early Christianity while supporting worthy causes, the Bart Ehrman blog is the perfect place to do it. Head to ehrmanblog.org to learn more and sign up today. It also makes an excellent Christmas gift for a believer or a non-believer. I don't have any kind of affiliate link or anything. I just think it's a great charity, and I've supported it for longer than I've been on YouTube. That said, I wished more people could hear this excellent debate on the Book of Acts, so I reached out to ask Bart and his team permission to reenact the debate here. Bart was totally on board, as long as, quote, I don't need him to do any recording, end quote. So in that spirit, please enjoy this reading by a computer who is definitely not Bart. In fact, we have 3 non-Barts: Professor Bart, Yes Bart, and No Bart.
As most readers of the blog know, I do a good number of public debates, almost always, I'm trying to think if there is an exception, with conservative Christians or fundamentalists who think that my views are dangerous to the good Christians of their communities, and to all those non-Christians they very much want to convert. My view all along has been that my historical views are not a threat to Christian faith, but only to a particular and particularly narrow understanding of that faith. But most of my debate partners can't see things that way. For them, their views are Christianity, and any other kind of Christianity is not actually Christianity. I usually look forward to these debates in advance, but I have to say that almost every time I'm actually having one, I start jotting notes to myself, asking, why am I doing this? Or why do I do this to myself? I often find the debates very frustrating. I imagine my debate partners do as well. They just can't understand why I don't see the truth, or rather, they think that because I'm a fallen creature who does not have faith, or am willful, or wicked, or rebellious, that I simply can't see the truth that is staring me right in the eyes. For my part, I certainly don't understand why they can't see the truth staring them in the eyes. And in my weaker moments, I tell myself that it's because they are so dogmatically tied to their views for very personal, emotional, and psychological reasons that they won't allow themselves to see what any reasonable person ought to see, whether it is about discrepancies and historical mistakes in the Bible, or about our highly unfortunate lack of early extensive manuscripts of the New Testament, or about how there can be such intense and meaningless suffering in a world supposedly ruled by an almighty God, or about any of the other things I debate. The bigger problem, of course, is that people in the audience also are already on one side or the other before the debate. And in most instances, the vast majority of all instances, they are there in order to see their side win. And they are bound and determined that, in fact, their side will win and afterward has won. An argument one side makes can be as fallible and specious as a person can humanly conceive. But it will sound convincing to people because it is what they want to hear. And when they hear it, they are convinced because they were convinced before they heard it. I think one of the most frustrating things for me is that in many instances, very many instances from what I can tell, it will be clear as day that a debater is using an argument that will be way over the heads of almost everyone in the audience. The kind of argument that takes years of training to follow and understand. The argument may be completely bogus, but the audience would have no way of knowing that, and demonstrating its fallacy would take something like an hour. But the argument is convincing to people because it is an argument being advanced by someone who is smarter, or at least more knowledgeable than they about this topic. And the very fact that a smart person can use such an argument shows that conclusion drawn, the one the listeners want to have drawn, is intellectually defensible. And since it is both the view they have always held and now can be shown to be defensible, well then, they can rest assured that they are on the side of truth. All of this became clear to me when I did something highly unusual in my introduction to the New Testament class. What I did is not actually unusual in the course. I do the same thing every year. But I would say that it is a highly unusual exercise. I don't think I've ever seen anyone else ever do it or heard of anyone doing it. The exercise is meant to show students how to engage in a public debate. The students need to know this because after spring break, which, thank the gods, is next week, each of them will be involved in a class debate in front of their small group, 20-person recitation, arguing the affirmative or negative side of a resolution. They have to prepare well in advance for these debates. I'll talk about them in a future post. So students have to have some sense about how to engage in a debate, and that means I have to show them. The sensible way to show them is to stage a debate in the larger lecture class. The problem is that in that context, it is very hard for me to find anyone who is willing to do a debate, for example, with me. Most of my graduate student teaching assistants do not want to go toe-to-toe with me. So how can I model a debate? For years, this is how I've done it. I debate myself. It's actually a good bit of fun. I have a resolution that I state. I then give an affirmative speech arguing for the resolution. Next, I give a negative speech against the resolution. I then give a negative rebuttal of what the affirmative side said, and I end by giving an affirmative rebuttal of what the negative side said. So I debated myself in class yesterday. When I was the affirmative team, I had on a sport jacket. When I was the negative team, I took off the jacket and put on a cap. Two different teams. The resolution I debated was this: resolved. The New Testament book of Acts is historically accurate. The affirmative side mounted arguments that Acts is accurate. The negative side argued it is not accurate. I threw myself into both sides with the best arguments I could make. In my personal judgment, based on many years of study, I am convinced that the negative side has the better argument. But I did my best to argue the alternative perspective as well. At the end, I had the students vote on which side they thought won. Just over half the class thought that the affirmative side won. Now, I know that side extremely well. I had just argued it, but I myself think it has a much weaker argument, and yet over half the class was convinced by it. That made me sigh and think. So my plan in this video is to show how this particular debate went by laying out the arguments made by each side, yes Bart and no Bart, and trying to expose the weaknesses of each in an effort to reflect on the importance of being able to argue both sides of a controversial issue and to reflect on whether debates actually do any good or not. To understand a debate about whether the book of Acts is historical, I first have to explain, by way of reminder or by way of minder, what the book of Acts is actually about. The first 4 books of the New Testament are Gospels, followed then by the book of Acts. The Gospels, each in their own way, present accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The book of Acts picks up where the Gospels drop off by describing the activities of Jesus' disciples after he is raised from the dead and then ascended into heaven. One key fact to bear in mind is that the author of Acts also wrote the Gospel of Luke. There really should be little debate about that, although as with every historical claim, there is always some debate. You can see for yourself just by reading the first few verses of Luke and then reading the first few verses of Acts. Acts is dedicated to the same person as Luke's Gospel, Theophilus, and refers back to the account already written about what Jesus said and did, which is what is in Luke, indicating that this then will be a second installment. The themes of the 2 books are very similar. There are lots of parallels between the 2 accounts. The writing style is very similar. The vocabulary is similar. The theology is similar. And so Luke and Acts are 2 volumes of the same work, a 2-volume work that discusses the rise of Christianity starting in volume 1 with the birth of Jesus, continuing through his life, death, and resurrection, continuing then in volume 2 with the birth of the Christian church, continuing on through its life and experiences, and detailing its spread throughout the Roman world until it reaches the capital of the empire, the city of Rome itself. The account picks up where Luke left off, with Jesus raised from the dead. Jesus, at the end of Luke's gospel, instructs his disciples, after his resurrection, to stay in Jerusalem until they receive the power from on high that they will need. In Acts, we're told they stayed in Jerusalem for 40 days, while Jesus proved to them with many proofs that he had been raised from the dead. That has always struck me as one of the strangest verses in the entire New Testament. Why would Jesus need to perform many proofs over 40 days in order to prove to someone that he was no longer dead? Wouldn't he simply have to show up and talk with them? Seems like that should do it. But in any event, according to Acts, Jesus spent 40 days with the disciples proving that he had been raised. He then instructed them to be his witnesses, not just in Jerusalem, where they were at the time, but also throughout Judea and Samaria and onto the ends of the earth. After giving this instruction, he physically ascended to heaven in their presence. A few days later came the day of Pentecost, an annual Jewish festival at which, on this occasion, the Holy Spirit came upon the followers of Jesus, causing them to speak in foreign languages that they didn't know in order to preach the gospel of Christ to Jews from around the world who had come to Jerusalem from around the world, each hearing the gospel in their own native language. This is the first miracle involving the apostles. More was to come. The disciples were empowered by the Spirit to heal and do other miracles and to preach the message of Christ's salvation. They did so, and many thousands of Jews convert just in Jerusalem itself, all in the space of 3 chapters. Eventually, though, the followers of Jesus encountered a determined opposition among the Jewish leaders, and many Christians scatter elsewhere, taking their gospel with them. The rest of Acts deals with life and mission of the Christians, especially the Apostle Paul, who starts out as an opponent of the church. He is portrayed as a zealous Jew who is violently opposed to the Christian message and its messengers, who is active in persecuting the church, and who is present at the stoning death of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. But then a great miracle occurs. Jesus appears to Paul, and blinded by the light, Paul realizes that Jesus really was raised from the dead and comes to be his greatest spokesperson. 2/3 of the book of Acts is about Paul and his subsequent missionary work. He takes 3 missionary journeys: his arrest, various judicial trials, and final journey to Rome, where he is to appear before Caesar to plead his case. The book ends with Paul in house arrest in Rome, preaching the gospel to all who visit him. This, then, is the earliest account we have of the birth and spread of the Christian church, especially at the hands of the Apostle Paul. Is it an accurate account? That is, does it recount what actually happened so that if you had been there, this is what you would have seen? If it's pretty accurate, is it entirely accurate? If it is pretty inaccurate, is it entirely inaccurate? All interesting questions. The debate is meant to deal not with whether it's a great story or not, but whether it replicates what happened. And as I indicated, it's a debate I used to have with myself, arguing both sides against each other in front of the class. Before I discuss the issue of Acts' historical reliability, the subject of my debate with myself in front of my undergraduate class, I need to provide a bit more background. In my textbook on the New Testament, I provide 2 brief discussions of the literary artistry of Luke, the alleged author of Acts. These discussions are relevant to the question of whether he means to present a disinterested historical account of what happened in early Christianity, or instead, B, a more artistic literary representation, in which historical information has been shaped for literary or theological reasons, or possibly, C, some kind of combination of the two, both a historical and a literary account. First, it is important to see how Luke makes certain events in the book of Acts parallel events that he earlier described in Volume 1, the Gospel of Luke in the life of Jesus. Then one should see how he establishes parallel events within Acts itself, say, between Peter in the first part and Paul in the second. Readers of the New Testament have long noticed many clear similarities between what happens to Jesus in the Gospel of Luke and to Christian believers in the book of Acts. These parallels show that Luke was no mere chronicler of events, set on providing an objective account of the early years of the Christian movement. He compiled this history with a clear purpose, part of which was to show that the hand of God was behind the mission of the church as much as it was behind the mission of Jesus. Thus, for example, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Luke, he is baptized and receives the Holy Spirit. When new believers are baptized in the book of Acts, they also receive the Spirit. The Spirit empowers Jesus to do miracles and to preach in Luke. So too, it empowers the apostles to do miracles and to preach in Acts. In Luke, Jesus heals the sick, casts out demons, and raises the dead. In Acts, the apostles heal the sick, cast out demons, and raise the dead. The Jewish authorities in Jerusalem confront Jesus in Luke. The same authorities confront the apostles in Acts. Jesus is imprisoned, condemned, and executed in Luke. Some of his followers are imprisoned, condemned, and executed in Acts. These parallels are not simply interesting coincidences. One author has produced both books, and he uses the parallel accounts to make a major point. The apostles continue to do Jesus' work and thereby prolong his mission through the power of the same Spirit. Thus, they engage in similar activities, experience similar receptions, and suffer similar fates. Luke's literary artistry is not limited to creating parallels between the Gospel and Acts. Just as interesting are the parallels between the main characters in the narrative of Acts itself, particularly between Peter, the main character of chapters 1 through 12, and Paul, the main character of chapters 13 through 28. Several examples of these parallels stand out. Both Peter and Paul preach sermons to Jewish crowds, and what they have to say is, in many respects, remarkably similar. Both perform amazing miracles. Both, for example, cure the sick without having any direct contact with them. Thus, Peter's shadow can bring healing, as can Paul's handkerchiefs. Both are violently opposed by leaders among the Jews, but vindicated by God. They are imprisoned for their proclamation, yet delivered from their chains by divine intervention. Perhaps most important of all, both become absolutely convinced on the grounds of divine revelation and the success of their proclamation that God has decided to admit Gentiles into the church without their first becoming Jews. These parallels reinforce our earlier impression that throughout this narrative, Luke is intent on showing that God is at work in the Christian mission. Those who are faithful to God give similar speeches with similar results. They perform similar miracles, receive similar revelations, and experience similar fates. Luke's artistry, then, serves a clear thematic purpose. The debate over the historical accuracy of the book of Acts is important, in no small measure because, as I have pointed out already, it provides us our one and only narrative of what was happening among the followers of Jesus in the years immediately after his death. This is the key formative period in the formation of Christianity. How did it start as a religion? Acts is our only surviving historical account, but is it an accurate history? The first thing to stress is that Acts, like all histories, is highly restrictive in what it talks about. It is not a comprehensive history and makes no pretense of being a comprehensive history. The title, The Acts of the Apostles, was given it by later readers and scribes. The author himself, whoever he was, does not give it a title. And this particular title is not particularly apt, for one very important reason. Most of the apostles do not figure in the account at all. This is a narrative of some, very few, of the activities of Peter, and to a lesser extent John, the main character of chapters 1 through 12, and of Paul, the main character of chapters 13 through 28. The other apostles figure in on the margins, and usually only as a group. Most of them are not even named, let alone discussed. What were Bartholomew or Jude or Matthew doing during these early years? We have no clue. They are not discussed. The apostles as a group do show up as leaders of the original church in Jerusalem, and there are mentions of individual apostles on occasion. For example, James, the son of Zebedee, is said to have been martyred by King Herod, and James, the brother of Jesus, not one of the original 12, is portrayed as the head of the church in Jerusalem. But for the most part, we learn nothing of what the apostles were individually doing at the time. Even the apostles that are principally discussed, Peter and Paul, are covered highly selectively, as one would expect from a book that describes events over a 30-year period or so in just 28 chapters. And when Peter and Paul are discussed, it is in order to advance the author's own way of thinking about this early period in Christian history, in order to develop key themes that he, the author, wants to promote. These themes include the following. 1. It was God, not humans, who was in charge of the spread of the Christian faith. When Jesus first meets the disciples after his resurrection, he tells them that the Holy Spirit will come upon them to empower them to be his witnesses throughout the world. And that's what happens in chapter 2. On the day of Pentecost, the Spirit descends on the followers of Jesus, rests upon them, and gives them the ability to preach the gospel in foreign tongues they don't know, so that visitors in town from around the world can hear the message. Throughout this entire narrative, it is God who is at work, doing miracles through the apostles, Peter and Paul, protecting them from serious harm, even when they are persecuted, and giving them power to proclaim salvation, leading to the conversion of many, many thousands. 2. As a result, nothing can stop the Christian mission. It does have nasty opponents, principally among the Jewish leaders who reject the followers of Jesus just as violently as they rejected Jesus himself. but no opposition can stand in the way of the remarkable success of the apostolic proclamation. The more the church is persecuted, the more it grows. If Paul is beaten in one place, he goes to the next. If he is jailed, God miraculously allows him to escape. If he is stoned, he calmly gets up and goes to the next town. Nothing can stop him or his message. Third, conversions happen because people see the great miracles that happen among and by the Christians. The followers of Jesus speak in foreign tongues they have never learned. Peter explains what it all means. And thousands convert. Peter heals a lame man and explains, and thousands convert. Paul heals and converts. Conversions happen because God is doing such great miracles. 4, those who convert are in almost complete harmony with one another. The early followers of Jesus in Jerusalem form a kind of commune where everyone sells their possessions and gives the proceeds to the apostles, who distribute them to those who are in need. All things are held in common. The followers of Jesus are focused not on material goods, but on prayer and service, and they are astoundingly harmonious with one another. When someone does get out of line, the apostles take care of it with the guidance and power of the Spirit, as when Peter slays 2 liars in their midst by simply speaking a word against them. Moreover, this too is a really key point. The apostles themselves are completely harmonious with no strife of any kind among them. Peter, James, Paul, Barnabas, they are all completely on the same page because they are all completely in tune with God and so with one another. 5, the message of the gospel, originally preached to Jews in Jerusalem, eventually moves out away from Jerusalem to important locations throughout the Roman Empire. Acts is principally about the astounding spread of Christianity to all people of the world. Most important, one could argue, this spread of the Christian message happens not only among Jews of the world, but among Gentiles as well. One could argue that this is the major theme of the book. The message of Jesus is for everyone, Jew and Gentile. And most critical of all, this means that Gentiles do not need to become Jews in order to be followers of Jesus. That is to say, Gentiles do not need to start following the Jewish laws that are widely seen as making Jews Jewish. For example, they do not need to be circumcised if they are men. They do not need to follow kosher food laws or observe the Sabbath or keep the Jewish festivals. Both Jew and Gentile can be followers of Jesus on equal terms. 7. At the same time, this is also highly important and not always appreciated by readers of Acts. For this book, there is nothing in Christianity that is contrary to Judaism. Paul himself never stops being a Jew, for example, even though he is an apostle to the Gentiles. He himself remains thoroughly Jewish in every way, but he insists that Gentiles who convert to follow Jesus do not need to become Jewish themselves, and in fact, they are not to become Jewish. I need to stress that these are literary and theological themes of the book. I am not saying that historically this is what really happened or what the early years of the Christian church were really like. It is how Luke portrays the situation. And so, again, one huge question is whether he is accurately describing the first 30 years of the Christian church. I am ready now to explain how I did the debate with myself in front of my undergraduate class on the resolution resolved. The book of Acts is historically reliable. As always happens in a debate, the affirmative side goes first and gives a prepared speech. In arguing for the affirmative, I made the following points. Note, I'm not saying I personally agree with these points, just as I'm not going to be saying that I agreed with the negative points. I'm simply making the best case I can for both positions. 1. The book of Acts is historically reliable, as can be seen by considering 3 major points. A. First, the author of the book of Acts explicitly tells us that he was concerned and committed to present a historically accurate account of the history of the early church. The author of Acts, of course, was the author of the Gospel of Luke, and the preface to Luke served as the preface to the entire 2-volume work. In that preface, the author tells us that he had followed all things closely and that he based his account on reports from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. That is, from those who were personally involved in the events he narrates and those to whom they told their accounts. Moreover, he stresses that his ultimate concern is to provide an orderly account of all the things that had happened. And so it was clearly his intention to write a historically accurate account. That in itself does not prove that he did so, but it does prove that this was his goal. He was not writing fiction, but what he understood to be historical fact. B. Second, the author was well positioned to do what he set out to do because he himself was an eyewitness to the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul, the main character of the book of Acts. There are 4 passages in Acts in which the author shifts from speaking in the third person about what they were doing to the first person, where he talks about what we were doing. These are the famous we passages of Acts, starting in chapter 16, where the author describes events that he participated in along with Paul and others. That is to say, not only did the author interview eyewitnesses, he was himself one. He knew Paul. He traveled with Paul. He talked with Paul. Who better to know about the activities and teachings of Paul than someone who actually was with him at the time? See. Third, not only did the author want to provide an accurate account, and not only was he in the position to do so, his account can be shown to be accurate at every point that it can be tested. There are two kinds of corroboration for his narrative: corroboration from the writings of Paul himself and corroboration from external, especially archaeological evidence. Two, with respect to Paul, sometimes the narrative of Acts will describe an event from Paul's life that Paul himself describes in one of the letters that he wrote. Whenever that happens, there is a remarkable consistency. For example, in Acts 15, we read that after Paul had been engaging in missionary activities converting Gentiles, there was a big debate about whether these converts had to submit to circumcision and adopt Jewish customs. A conference was called in Jerusalem that Paul attended with other apostles, where it was decided that the answer was no. Gentiles did not have to become Jews in order to be Christian. Paul, too, talks about the Jerusalem conference in Galatians 1-2 and says very much the same thing. It was a consultation with apostles in Jerusalem after his missionary activities, and the decision was reached that Gentiles could convert as Gentiles, not as Jews. They did not have to follow the requirements of the Jewish law. The two accounts stand together in harmony. Third, or a second example, in Acts 17, we read about Paul's missionary journey that took him from the city of Thessalonica to Athens, where he preached on the Areopagus to Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. In 1 Thessalonians 3, Paul refers to the same journey, where he indicates that after leaving Thessalonica, he went to Athens, the same information. Acts appears to be reliable whenever it can be tested against the major primary source, the writings of Paul. The second kind of corroboration is between Acts and external sources, such as archaeology. Archaeological discoveries have verified the accounts of Acts up and down the line. This author can be shown to be intimately familiar with the geography, customs, and laws that he describes in his account. 5. For example, we now know the site of the famous Areopagus speech, and you can visit it today. It sits on a rocky outcrop just below the Acropolis in Athens, and we now know that it was indeed a place where philosophers would gather to talk and debate, just as Luke describes it in Acts 17:6. Or take Thessalonica. In the account of Acts, Paul is said to have encountered a group of local leaders that Luke calls politarchs, which literally would mean something like rulers of the city. For decades, liberal scholars claimed that Luke was making that up. We had no knowledge of such a thing as a politarch. The word never occurs in Greek literature, but then archaeologists dug up the city of Thessalonica and discovered a large number of bricks on which were described the names of numerous different politarchs. These bricks use the same word to describe the same people. Archaeology has confirmed Luke's account. Consider a seventh instance. In Acts 14, on his first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas are in the town of Lystra, where Paul heals a man who was lame. The pagan crowd sees this happen and assume that Paul and Barnabas must be two gods who have come down to work among them. They assume they are Hermes and Zeus. The pagan priest of Zeus fetches a bull and takes it outside the city walls to sacrifice it on the altar there to Paul's Zeus, who fervently urges him not to so, since he is a mere mortal. For decades, liberal scholars argued that this could not have happened because there would not have been an altar to Zeus outside the walls of the town. Altars were located within city walls. But then archaeologists dug up Lystra, and what did they find? They found a temple of Zeus outside the walls. Once again, the archaeological record has verified the narrative of Acts. This kind of verification happens time and time again. 8. In sum, the author of Luke wanted to produce a historically accurate account. He tells us so. Moreover, he was well situated to write just such an account, as he was personally involved in the events that he narrates. And most important, whenever his account can be checked against a primary source, the writings of Paul himself, and against archaeological discoveries, his narrative is verified repeatedly, up and down the line. The Book of Acts is historically reliable. That, in a nutshell, is the affirmative case that I make. Before I argue that the book is not reliable, I need to take a time out and explain one negative counter-argument that would take too much space if it were simply part of a longer post laying out the negative position. The affirmative side in the debate argued that based on archaeological evidence, Luke can be shown to have presented accurately the laws, custom, and geography mentioned or alluded to in the book of Acts. There really was an Areopagus where philosophers gathered, as mentioned in Acts 17. Thessalonica really did have local rulers called politarchs. Lystra really did have a temple of Zeus located outside its city walls. That all sounds very impressive in the abstract that Luke's account can be and has been verified by significant archaeological discoveries. The negative side of the debate, however, maintains that this information is completely irrelevant to the issue. The reason is this: we would expect that an author from the first century Roman Empire, one who was well-traveled especially, to be familiar with the first century Roman Empire. That doesn't mean that the stories he sets within the first century Roman Empire are true. He might well know about the politarchs in Thessalonica or the Temple of Zeus in Lystra, but that has no bearing on the question of whether the stories that he sets in those contexts really happened or not. In other words, the affirmative side is arguing a true but irrelevant point. When I try to explain this to my students, I give them an illustration. Suppose someone were to publish a newspaper article next week about something that happened yesterday on March 28th, 2016, to me, Bart Ehrman. The article indicates that I left my office building on UNC Chapel Hill campus, Carolina Hall, walked over to the Haynes Art Center in order to give a lecture for my Introduction to the New Testament class. But before I reached the building, there was a deafening explosion. Terrorists had set a bomb and it leveled the building, killing dozens of innocent people. 2,000 years from now, someone uncovers the article and sets out to see if this story is true. Based on other literary references, they discover where a city called Chapel Hill used to be in a state that was named North Carolina. They undertake an archaeological dig, and lo and behold, the article is right. There really was a Chapel Hill in a place called North Carolina. Moreover, they find all sorts of buildings that must have been classrooms and offices. There really was a university there. They happen to unearth the registrar's office, and they find substantial, important documentary evidence. There really was a Bart Ehrman who taught there at the time at UNC Chapel Hill. He really did have an office in Carolina Hall. And wonder of wonders, he really did teach a class on the New Testament on Wednesdays in Haynes Art Center. Archaeology has now shown that the story discovered in the newspaper is true. It has been confirmed. Right? Wrong. What has been confirmed is that the person who wrote the article knew about Chapel Hill, about Bart Ehrman, about where his office was, and about where his course was held. The story itself is about a building being blown up, and that didn't happen. The story itself is completely wrong, except in the locations of cities, the names of buildings, and the names of the main character. What the story said happened is nowhere near being true. When archaeology shows that there really was an Areopagus and Thessalonian politarchs and a temple to Zeus outside of Lystra, it shows that the author of the book of Acts was a well-traveled person from the first century Roman Empire. That has no bearing on the question of whether the accounts that he places in Athens, Thessalonica, or Lystra actually happened. Of course, if he got all sorts of information wrong about those places, it would show that he didn't really know about them. Think Dan Brown and his knowledge of Paris. But if he did know about them, it simply shows that he had once been there or heard reliable information about the places. When one wants to know if the book of Acts is historically reliable, one is, of course, interested in knowing if the author has a good knowledge of the laws, customs, and geography of his own time. That's worth knowing. But even more than that, one wants to know whether the episodes that he describes really took place, either at all or in the ways that he describes. For that kind of information, archaeology will rarely help us. The affirmative side, therefore, has not advanced an argument that demonstrates its case, that the book of Acts is historically reliable. The argument instead is smoke and mirrors. I point this out because it's an argument that gets used a lot. The New Testament book of Acts is not historically reliable. Before showing that to be the case, I want to make two preliminary remarks, both of them related to the question of what it means for an ostensibly historical account, a narrative of what allegedly happened in the past, to be reliable. First, when readers today want to know whether the book of Acts is reliable, they mean that they want to know whether the events that it narrates actually happened in the way it describes or not. Readers are not primarily interested in knowing if he wrote his account the way other authors in his day would have done. They are mainly interested in knowing whether his narrative happened the way he says it did. Second, it is indeed important to know whether the author of the account had a solid and accurate knowledge of the laws, customs, and institutions of his day. If he did not, then obviously he cannot be historically reliable. But even if he does, that in itself has no bearing on whether the stories he tells actually happen. An author may well know that in the city of Lystra there was a temple of Zeus outside the city walls, but that has no bearing on whether what he says happened in that temple is historically true or not. The affirmative side wants to argue that the fact that Luke was knowledgeable about the first century, and that can easily be conceded. Of course he did. He lived in the first century. Naturally, he knows about it, but that has no relevance to the question of whether the narratives he sets in the first century happened the way he says they did. There are two major ways to check to see if Luke is historically accurate. The first is to see if he is internally consistent in his telling of his stories. If not, then that would show that he is not particularly concerned to get the facts straight. The second is to compare him with other reliable sources of the time to see if they coincide or not. As it turns out, a number of things that Luke says about Paul are things that Paul himself talks about, so we can compare the two. Whenever they talk about the same thing, they are at odds with one another. Luke does not appear to be historically accurate. First, internal consistency. Luke sometimes tells the same story 2 or even 3 times. Now, when he does so, there are striking contradictions, which show, among other things, that Luke is more interested in spinning a good yarn than he is in preserving a historically accurate narrative. Let me cite 2 examples. First, Jesus' ascension. In Luke 24, you can read it for yourself and see. Jesus rises from the dead on that day, meets with his disciples, and then again that day, he ascends to heaven from the town of Bethany. But when you read Acts 1, written by the same author, you find that Jesus did not ascend on that day or at that place. Jesus instead spends 40 days with his disciples proving to them that he had been raised from the dead. It's not clear why he would have to prove it, let alone do so for 40 days. And only then, 40 days after the resurrection, does he ascend. And here he ascends not from Bethany, but from Jerusalem. Luke tells the same story twice and in 2 radically different ways. Historical accuracy does not appear to be his major concern. Second example, on 3 occasions, Acts narrates the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus, chapters 9, 22, and 26. Compare them closely to one another, and you find very odd contradictions. In chapter 9, Paul's companions hear the voice of Jesus talking to Paul, but they don't see anyone. In chapter 22, they see the light, but don't hear anything. Which is it? In chapter 9, the companions are left standing while Paul falls to the ground. In chapter 26, they are all knocked to the ground. Which is it? In chapters 9 and 22, Paul is told to go to Damascus to be instructed by a man named Ananias about what to do next. In chapter 26, Paul is not told to go be instructed by Ananias. Instead, Jesus himself instructs him. Well, which is it? All these examples simply show that Luke was far more interested in telling a gripping story than he was in being consistent. His artistic license has seriously undercut his historical accuracy. But even more noteworthy are the external contradictions with a reliable source, Paul himself. Whenever Acts relates an incident from Paul's life that Paul himself discusses, there are striking and irreconcilable differences. Sometimes these involve small details. For example, Acts 17 is clear and unambiguous. When Paul traveled to bring the gospel to Athens, he came by himself, without Timothy or any of the other apostles. But Paul himself is also clear and unambiguous. In 1 Thessalonians 3, we learn that he came to Athens precisely in the company of Timothy, not by himself. It couldn't be both. Sometimes the differences really matter. When Paul himself talks about his conversion in Galatians 1, he insists that after he had his vision of Jesus, he did not. He absolutely and positively did not, he swears to it, go to confer with the other apostles in Jerusalem, not for years. And what happens when Paul converts, according to Acts 9? What is the first thing he does after he leaves Damascus? He makes a beeline to Jerusalem to confer with the other apostles. In Acts, he does precisely what he himself swears in Galatians 1 that he didn't do. Even more striking than the contradictions in the itinerary and travels of Paul are the discrepancies in his preaching. Here I give just one example. In Acts 17, when Paul is preaching to the pagans of Athens, he tells them that they worship idols out of ignorance. They simply don't know any better. And because of that, God overlooks their mistake. But he now gives them a chance to recognize the truth and worship him alone. That stands in sharp contrast with the views that Paul himself lays out in his letter to the Romans. In chapter 1, Paul states his views of pagan idolatry and false worship, and they are completely contrary to what he allegedly said in Acts 17. In Romans, Paul tells us that pagans worship idols precisely because they did know that there was only one God who was to be worshipped, and they rejected that knowledge in full consciousness of what they were doing. And because of that, God has cast his wrath down upon them. Well, which is it? Do they commit idolatry out of pure ignorance, so God overlooks their mistake? Or are they fully aware of what they're doing, so God judges them? Assuming Paul himself knew what his own views were, you would have to say that Acts has misrepresented the very core of his preaching message. Every time you compare what Acts has to say about Paul with what Paul has to say about himself, you find discrepancies, just as you find discrepancies internally whenever Acts recounts the same event more than once. As valuable as Acts may be as an interesting story about the first years and decades of the early Christian movement, the reality is that the book of Acts is not historically reliable. If you choose to go point by point through the affirmative team's case that the book of Acts is historically reliable, you will find that they have advanced their views on very thin grounds. The affirmative team begins by arguing that the author of Acts expresses his intention of giving a historically reliable account based on eyewitnesses. To that, we have two responses. First, the fact that an author tries to be reliable has no bearing on whether he is reliable. To be sure, if an author tells you that his intention is to be unreliable, then well, you can probably count on him being so. But just because someone wants to be reliable does not mean his account necessarily is so. His account has to be checked to see. Second, the author does not actually say that he consulted with eyewitnesses to give us his account. It is true that in Luke 1:1-4, the author indicates that the stories he is about to relate were originally given out by eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. But this verse is often misread as indicating that he personally consulted with eyewitnesses. That's not what it says. The author never claims to have talked with an eyewitness, let alone about a group of eyewitnesses. All he is saying is that the accounts about Jesus and his followers were originally told by eyewitnesses. That is certainly true, but it doesn't mean that he himself knows any of these eyewitnesses. He gives no indication that he did, but was he himself an eyewitness? That is what the affirmative side wants to argue, that the four we passages in Acts indicate places where the author himself was a companion of Paul, and that if he was Paul's traveling partner, he would have been himself an eyewitness to Paul's life and teachings. And if that's the case, then we can trust that what he says in his account is accurate. There are two things to say about all that. The first is that the we passages may not in fact indicate that the author was Paul's traveling companion. The second is that even if he were, that would not in and of itself show that he was accurate in what he had to say about Paul. One would need to test the hypothesis to see if it's true. And to everyone's great regret, when you actually compare what Acts says about Paul with what Paul says about himself, you find numerous and deep inconsistencies. But first, the we passages. What the affirmative side failed to point out is that these four passages are very odd in one particular respect. They begin and end with uncanny abruptness. The author is talking about Paul and his companions, and then out of the blue, he starts speaking in the first person, not about what they were doing, but about what we were. But never does he say, then I joined with them and we, or then I left and they. Instead, the first person pronoun, we, starts without warning and ends without warning. So much so that a casual reader doesn't even notice that the author is no longer talking about what we were doing. Why is that? If the author was claiming that at these points of the narrative he joined the apostolic band, why doesn't he say so? Scholars have suggested numerous solutions to this problem over the years. Two of the most plausible suggestions are the following. One, possibly the author was incorporating a travelogue into his account, a kind of itinerary kept by someone who joined Paul for a few of his journeys. We know the author of Luke Acts was fond of using sources. In his gospel, for example, he simply copied much of what he found in Mark and in Q. It's possible he did something similar in Acts. He had a source kept by someone who was with Paul a few times and simply copied it into his account. That's why the we passages begin and end so abruptly. Two, more recently, as has been argued, even more plausibly, that the author is simply using a well-known and common ancient writing device, in which an author begins talking in the first person in order to make his readers think that he was personally involved with the accounts he is narrating. This happens a lot in the New Testament itself with the first person plural we. For example, John 21:24, 2 Peter 1:16-19, 1 John 1-4. And it happens a lot outside the New Testament. For example, in the Gospel of Peter, the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, or the Apocryphon of John. If this is the right way to understand the passages, the author is using the first-person narrative to make his readers think he was a companion of Paul. This would explain the abrupt beginning and ending of the we passages. But why should we think that he was not a companion of Paul? Or even if he was a companion of Paul, why should we think that his accounts are not accurate? There is the same answer to both questions. The author's account can be shown not to be accurate, and almost certainly not to be written by someone intimately familiar with Paul. As we have already argued in place after place after place where Acts describes something Paul said or did, and Paul talks about the exact same thing, there are discrepancies, and errors. This author does not appear to know where Paul went, when, and with whom. He does not accurately or fairly portray Paul's teaching and preaching. He does not seem to know the very essence of Paul's theology. If this book was written by a companion of Paul, he was a companion who was not paying close attention. Or more likely, he wasn't a companion of Paul. In either case, what he says about Paul cannot be reconciled with what Paul says about himself. As a result, the book of Acts cannot be accepted as historically accurate. Despite what the negative side has maintained, we remain convinced that the New Testament book of Acts is historically reliable. The first point to stress is that it is of utmost importance that we not impose modern standards of historical accuracy on an ancient text. Of course, the author of Acts did not follow the historiographic methods that developed in European circles of the 19th and 20th centuries. He was a first century author, and as such, he followed first century historiographic techniques. He can scarcely be faulted for that. And by the standards of his own day, Luke was a superb historian. He expressed his desire to present an accurate account. He acquired his information from eyewitnesses and others who knew what had transpired in the early years of the Christian movement. He himself was a participant in many of the events that he narrates. And when you can compare what he has to say about those events with what his leading figure, Paul himself, says, you find that they are in striking overall agreement. Now, the negative side wants to argue that there are details that differ between Luke's account and Paul's version of the same events. But you will notice that in almost every case, the differences they cite are small, picayune little details. Rarely do they entail large or general disagreements. And that's for a good reason. When it comes to major events involving both Paul's itinerary and his preaching, Luke and Paul are very much on the same page. We shouldn't expect an ancient historian to get every tiny detail right in every single account. What we look for is broad-based accuracy. And that's what we find up and down the line. To expect anything more than that is to impose modern standards on an ancient text. The negative side pointed to one passage in which they maintained that Paul is said to have proclaimed a message in Acts 17 to the pagan philosophers on the Areopagus in Athens that is contrary to his own proclamation in the letter to the Romans chapter 1. But our opponents have failed to consider, or at least to mention, a crucial point that altogether undercuts their case. They have failed to consider the context within which Paul's words were delivered in Acts, in contrast to the context within which he wrote Romans 1. Yes, it is true that in Paul's speech in Acts, he indicates that God has overlooked the ignorance of pagans in worshiping idols. And in Romans, he stresses that God has revealed his wrath against pagans who knowingly have rejected him. But consider his audience in both cases. In Acts, he is speaking to pagans in order to convert them. In Romans, he is speaking to the already converted opponents of pagans. In his speech to the philosophers in Acts, he clearly wants to make his message as attractive as possible in order to persuade others to accept it. So, of course, he is not going to blast away at them with accusatory rhetoric. He is going to try to win them over to his gospel. In the letter to the Romans, on the other hand, he is explaining his deeper theological views, that the very reason pagans worshipped idols in the first place was because they had rejected the knowledge of God that they had from the beginning. The difference between the passages is not a contradiction. The difference is the audience. Paul preaches one thing to pagans, but explains another thing to Christians. This does not make his speech in Acts unhistorical. It makes it contextual. In considering whether Acts is historically reliable, we need to stress yet again that every time archaeologists have made a relevant discovery that can help us decide the issue, they have found that the author of Acts is remarkably knowledgeable about the persons, places, and events that he narrates. That is true of the Areopagus in Athens, of the politarchs of Thessalonica, and of the altar to Zeus outside the city walls of Lystra. Time and again, Luke's accuracy has been validated by the archaeologist Spade, and the negative team has not been able to deny it. In sum, Luke set out to present an accurate account of the spread of the Christian church. He himself says that is what he attempted to do, and he was unusually well placed in order to accomplish the task. He was intimately acquainted with the leading characters of his account, and he himself was an eyewitness to many of the events he narrated. Archaeological discoveries have repeatedly confirmed his reports, and never have they contradicted them. Of course, he was not a modern 21st century historian with modern research methods and data retrieval systems. He was an ancient author, an ancient historian, one who followed ancient historiographic practices, and one who did so with extreme care and high accuracy. In both its overarching narrative and in the details of its episodes, the Book of Acts is historically reliable. I have pointed out on the blog before that even though I do a lot of public debates, I often find them more than a little frustrating, and frequently, in fact, almost always, ask myself in the course of the debate why I'm doing this to myself. People basically hear what they want to hear, and most of the time, people simply want to hear someone arguing for the position that they already hold in order to confirm to themselves that they are right. Nearly everyone does this. So what's the point? People come in almost always either agreeing or disagreeing with me, and almost nothing I say or my opponent says will change their mind. They will simply feel confirmed by the side they already agree with. I feel that frustration even in this debate that I have with myself. The first time I did this debate, after it was over, I asked my class of 140 students which side they thought won the debate. And about 2/3 of the class thought that the affirmative side did, the side arguing that Acts was in fact historically accurate. I find that frustrating because I myself hold to the other view, and I think the affirmative side has been very slippery in its use of evidence. But I guess slippery really works. My view is that several of the most important arguments of the affirmative side, which I advanced with conviction, are completely irrelevant, even if they are rhetorically effective. That combination always aggravates me, especially when they are rhetorically effective, but irrelevant arguments that someone else makes. One key point that my students always find significant and enlightening is the affirmative claim that we should not hold ancient historical sources to modern standards, but need to recognize that they are following the procedures of ancient times. In this argument, as you'll recall, the affirmative insists that it is inappropriate to insist that an ancient text, such as Acts, be accurate in the ways that we today demand for accuracy from modern historians. It's an ancient text, and so should be held to ancient standards. And by those standards, the argument goes, the author of Acts was a very good historian. So let me be clear. I completely agree that we need to understand a literary text and its author in light of their own context, and that we should not remove the text from its context when trying to interpret it. I spent a good deal of my entire semester trying to drum this idea into my students' heads. Anytime you remove a text from its context, you radically change its meaning. We should study texts in light of their contexts. Completely agreed. That's what makes this argument so seemingly effective. But in reality, it is also completely irrelevant to the question being debated. When someone today wants to know if an ancient historical narrative is historically accurate, what they mean by that is something like this. Does it tell us what actually happened in the way that it happened? Or not? When people ask these questions, they are not asking, is Luke as a historian as good a historian as Tacitus or Josephus or some other ancient historian? They are not asking, does he follow the historiographical methods of his day? They're not asking, would ancient readers consider this to be a good account following their own standards? None of those things is what most modern readers are interested in. Modern readers are interested in knowing whether the events the text describes really happened, and really happened in the way that it describes, yes or no. That's a completely different question from the question of how to interpret the book in light of its own historical context. And many people just don't see the difference. It's a huge difference. The affirmative team blurs the distinction and shifts the attention of the question onto something that is important in and of itself, but irrelevant to the resolution. Let me put it like this. Suppose you could show that ancient historians were never accurate at all, but were completely inaccurate in everything that they ever said. You would never be able to show this, but suppose you could show it. And then you took one of these historians and you said that this particular historian is just as good as his peers. His work is a model example of how historians in his period did their work. Would you conclude then that his work is historically accurate? just the opposite. You would have thereby shown that his work is almost certainly highly inaccurate. When it comes to the book of Acts, to argue that Luke follows the historiographic procedures of his day is important for anyone who wants to know how the book works as a piece of historiography. Highly important, but it is irrelevant to the question of whether it is accurate or not. By accuracy, people do not mean, is it as good as anything else from its time period? They mean instead, can I trust that what it says happened really happened, and in the way that it describes? It would be a very different debate, requiring different kinds of evidence if the resolution were something like resolved. The author of Acts was a very good historian when judged by the standards of his day. Or resolved. The book of Acts is an excellent example of ancient historiography. But that's not what the resolution I was debating was whether the book of Acts is historically reliable or not. That's another question.